Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with random book reviews from the Overflow Room Annex. Bong. Yeah, I could do something with the gong if I wanted to. Well, here we are annexing, and I've got some very interesting books to talk about in this series of videos. First, we've been doing Hindemith in random reviews from the Overflow Room, and I have a bunch of textbooks by same, including this thing, Paul Hindemith, Traditional Harmony, Book 1. Hindemith's remarkable textbooks are still outstanding works of their kind, in contrast to many musical textbooks written by academic musicians. Right? These were produced by a man who could play every instrument of the orchestra, could compose a satisfying piece for almost any kind of ensemble, and who was one of the most stimulating teachers of his day. So these are like fun books, kind of. They consist of elementary training for musicians, the craft of musical composition, and traditional harmony, Book 1 and Book 2, advanced exercises. I never got to Book 2. Let me be honest, I never even got to Book 1. I read it. Did I do all the exercises? You must be on drugs. Of course not. I didn't even think about it. But there's a nice little preface and a funny little note by Hindemith to the second edition, which I think I'd like to share with you because it's really cute. Preface to the second edition of 1944 in good old New Haven. He was here in the U.S. To the author of a harmony book, phrases like 60,000, 20th edition, popular priced reprint will always sound like some legendary song of the sirens. In general, he can be happy if the comparatively few copies of the first printing find buyers without too much trouble. With this prospect in mind, I hardly expected anything more for the present little work than a moderate interest, particularly since it came into being in the first place only as a byproduct of more important labors, and had no further purpose than to present to a few teachers and students struggling with similar problems some teaching material that had been found practical. Yet only a year after the first publication, a second edition is needed. Whether that fact is due to the nature and arrangement of the book, or present conditions are particularly favorable to the distribution of such a work, or the sales have resulted from mere curiosity, these questions must remain unanswered here. I content myself with wishing the second edition good luck, too, as it sets out upon its road. Yeah, I just think that's charming, isn't it? I mean, we wish it well. And it did well, actually. Then we have, here's a very, very interesting book, In Search of New Scales. This is musicology at its best, I think. Prince Edmond de Polignac, Octatonic Explorer, by Sylvia Kahan. Now, Sylvia Kahan is a friend of mine, wonderful pianist and musicologist specializing in French music at the turn of the century, the fin de siècle period, and with a particular emphasis on the Polignacs, the Prince Edmund and the Princess de Polignac, Winnaretta Singer, about whom she's written quite a bit and gives wonderfully delightful lectures and talks. She's a wonderful person. But Edmond de Polignac, let's see, how do we do this? Now, the Princess de Polignac is a very well-known character. She was an heiress, an heiress of the Singer sewing machine fortune. She was she presided over one of the great salons in Paris in the early decades of the 20th century. She commissioned all kinds of things: Poulenc's Concert Champêtre, Fayas, harpsichord concerto, and Wanda Landowska hung out there, and pianists and singers galore. She and her husband had one of the strangest relationships in all of musical history. Prince Edmund was a hypochondriac composer who was from a noble family but was extremely poor. She had to find a husband in society of those days. She was very, very desirable because she was very, very wealthy. But here was the problem. Prince Edmund was gay and she was a lesbian. She married initially, and on her wedding night threatened to murder her husband if he so much as tried to touch her. So they got divorced, and when they met, it was one of those fabulous things where each had something the other wanted. He had a title, which would have served her very, very well in French society before the wars, late 19th century. And she had money, which he desperately needed because they had none, his family. So they got married. And lo and behold, even though there was nothing physical between them and there was a huge age difference, he was much older than she was, they fell in love. They had a wonderful, wonderful relationship. The marriage did not last very long because he was older and he was always ill. But they had a genuine love of music. And so it was a perfect marriage. Absolutely perfect marriage. It just had no sex. And they were happy. And she wound up with the title, the Princess de Polignac. He wound up with piles of money that they could spend together. He wasn't profligate. He wasn't out to exploit her. He was none of those things. He could just compose the music he wanted to compose. He was an avant-garde composer in the late 19th century, who was one of the founders of the method of composition using octatonic scales. Now, you may not care about octatonic scales. The person who was most famous for using octatonic scales was Rimsky-Korsakov in his late music. And Stravinsky was also in his early works, like the Firebird, use octatonic scales. And we don't have to care what octatonic scales are. They're somewhat exotic and dissonant sounding. But Edmund here wrote a whole treatise on composing using octatonic scales at around the same time that Rimsky was starting to talk about them as well. So he was a pioneer and a very interesting musical figure. And his compositions are completely unknown, but there are a few of them. And they employ his method. And Sylvia wrote this absolutely marvelous book about searching for new scales of the Princess Edmond de Polignac. His life is colorful and very interesting. His music begs to be heard. And I really enjoyed this book. I really did. Some of it gets a bit technical when they go through his treatise on octatonic scale composition. You may not want to care, but the biography is just terrific. So that was a lot of fun. It really was. And then this thing, what is this? This is, the Richard Strauss Companion by Mark Daniel Schmid. This is one of the things that I was using for research. It was an old library. See, I got all these used books from library remainders. And it's very interesting. We have the influences on Strauss, the instrumental works, talked about, the vocal works, including the Salome and the early operas, the late operas, Strauss's poetic imagination, the leader, and the challenge of the choral works. And these are all essays by different Strauss scholars. Now, this is one of the books that I got my hands on because I was writing my book on Strauss, on his orchestral works. And so I needed to get as much info as I possibly could and do my research. So this was part of that, and it's a very good and very interesting collection of essays on Richard Strauss. So that's the Richard Strauss Companion by Mark Daniel Schmid, just to recapitulate what we did here. In Search of New Scales by Sylvia Kahan. Yeah, cool stuff. The Prince Edmund de Polignac, if you ever wondered what that thing was about. And Hindemith's Traditional Harmony, Book 1 by Hindemith. There's a collection you can sink your teeth into. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.